Hello. Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Good to see you. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So welcome. Welcome to all of you. And I'm very excited to be here to run these workshops looking at the wise stories of Nahman from Uman and doing some of our own writing around and into these stories. So you're very warmly welcome here this evening or whichever time zone you're in this afternoon. So this first class is going to be somewhat of an introductory talk by myself. I'd like to say a little about my approach to the stories and to writing around them. First, I want to check, can everyone hear me well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, good. All right. If you want to you can keep your cameras on if possible. That's great. Yeah. Okay. So welcome to all of you. So before we begin the first story that we'll look at together, which is a story of a pauper who supported himself by digging clay, or what I often refer to as the diamond and the grain story, instead of formally going around the group to introduce each other, I'll suggest a writing exercise at the end where you can share how you came to know these stories or say something about their place in your life. And I'd like to say something about that myself now in the half an hour that we have together here tonight. So when I was a very young child, I was asked by the adults around me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I remember clearly my response and the shocked faces. And I remember the image I had of who I would be when I was older. So I wanted I wanted to be a wise old man with a long beard, a hermit, a solitary person, and yet also a teacher. And perhaps I wanted to be an elderly male Hasidic rabbi, or who knows, perhaps that was once who I had been in another life, or it was somewhere in my DNA, because it was certainly logical to me as a young girl that I would grow up to be that person. And when I replied to the adults, it wasn't so much for me a question of what I wanted to be, but of what I inevitably would become. So this odd recollection for me is linked to the mysteries of how I know Rabbi Nahman's stories. I didn't grow up in a Hasidic or in a Jewish community, but these stories, they were on my lips as a young girl, and they were in an aspect of reality that's really suffused with God's spirit for me, and also a place where I began many life trials. So I'm hesitant to go into much detail about that place, but it was where I grew up. There was a village. I'll try to share a picture. And there was a very old grain store adjacent to where I was. This is a picture of it. It's a place in England. So a very ancient store for grain in the olden times. A beautiful sunny day in the picture. Yes. So yeah, that's where I was. And as I say, I was beside the grain store. I was teaching in a Sunday school actually as a girl. I was about 12 or 13 years old. And over the course of life's trials, I forgot so much of my childhood. But eventually, and isn't that a very Nahman from Uman word? Eventually, ultimately, finally, so many of his stories could be captured by that word, or at long last. I remembered the stories and I remembered telling them. And actually what happened was that I was reading through the many diaries that I'd kept as a child. And in these little diaries were notes of the stories that I told the little children. And it was clear when I read them that these were the stories of Nahman from Uman. So I didn't know how I knew them. I don't know now how I knew them. I can only conjecture, I can only guess, and I can imagine I know how I knew them. But what I do remember is their holiness, their strength, as I told them, outside of myself, but also, you know, chiming from within. So eventually I found my way back to Rabbi Nahman, which has also been my journey. I'm not quite sure which preposition to use here, like towards or from or into the Jewish tradition, even though, as I say, I didn't grow up Jewish. So I hope and trust that I'm not telling this story to mythologize myself. But I think that Nahman, our teacher, he does teach that human individuals can contain multiple realities, and our lives' trajectories can collide with mythical realities. So he's constantly teaching us about this collision between the ordinary, the extraordinary, the secular, like my childhood scribbled notes on the stories I was telling in my little notebooks, and the sacred, which is this feeling of a reality that was so deep and so holy, in that place for me as the little storyteller. So I'm really looking forward in the writing exercise to hearing, if you care to share, how you came to know the stories of Rabbi Nahman or their place in your own life. It's a question I want to ask for the first writing exercise. So before we begin, I wanted to say something else about where to find the stories, the sources. The many places of Rabbi Nahman's stories today, so long after they were told, between 1806 and 1810, I believe, and his great-grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov, having died in 1760. So there's clearly quite a complex chain of transmission of the stories. And Elie Wiesel talks about that in his very interesting recorded lecture from 1967, which if I believe some of you will have seen it, but others may have not done. It's available to listen to online. I'll send the link later, but this recorded lecture from 1967, where he speaks about legends of Hasidism, and he really focuses on the stories of Nahman from Uman or Nathan of Breslov. So I recommend that. I'll send the link into the group later. So yeah, there is this complex chain of transmission, and comparing Nahman and Kafka, who both died young of lung disease, Wiesel noted that both demanded their writing be destroyed, but each had a friend who preserved the narratives. And here that was Nathan Sternhartz of Nemirov or Reb Nosson. And he adds, though, that Nahman did want his tales and sayings not to be forgotten, but his handwritten texts he wanted to be destroyed. That's what we hear from Elie Wiesel in his lecture. So there are questions about writing down what were oral stories, I guess, in Yiddish, and then becoming literature in translation from Yiddish and Hebrew. The stories are available on Sefaria. I'll share the link, and again, I'm sure some of you are well aware of that, but just to make sure that everyone has a link to read them. Not just, in fact, the 13 tales, but 7 additional tales, and not all translated into English. But beyond those, there are also stories that actually appear in other records of what Nahman taught. There is, I think, a new book from the Breslov community of this year. Again, I'll share the link. I have a different copy, but I've also read various translations and readings across the web. I'm still in the middle of reading. I can't say that my reading is finished because there are different stories, different versions. It's just begun. But my own way, given the various sources of the stories, has been to know that the texts were very carefully told. So choices of words do matter in translations. For example, in one of the stories, does the man play a violin or a harp? And it may matter symbolically, it may matter. But also, I have had faith that because these stories really are an incredible gift with which we are entrusted, we can believe that we will be given help in discerning the text when choosing between the different renditions, the different versions, and being alive to the importance actually of the questions that these discrepancies and differences can open up. So noting the different places where we find the stories testifies to the multi-dimensional appeal of the stories as well. So definitely not just amongst the bearded male Breslov Hasidim, although their commentaries on the stories are often really valuable. So Rav Ifra is currently interpreting them on public videos from the viewpoint which is similar to my own, of finding in them great guidance and strength for personal spiritual awakening or collective work towards the coming of the Mashiach. But they are also very much celebrated, of course, by different active spiritual communities. Then the stories are studied in academic settings, in critical books and articles. I have Ora Wiskendelpa's book, which often associates the stories with Torah teachings, but it also gives many insights into how the stories are fashioned with recurrent characters, motifs. And the stories have inspired and continue to inspire. I think I have one here. Children's stories, other arts such as theatre, homemade puppet show videos, a huge creative wealth coming from these stories. So for me, the spiritual thread is very strong, which means that I'm not really approaching these stories from a purely literary critical kind of perspective, but rather because of their mystical power. And I recently read a lovely definition of mysticism by Yehuda Vogel, who says, mysticism is hard to define, and as an experience-driven realm of knowledge, in some ways it can only be approached in a circumambulatory nature, by circling the experience of the divine until one gains a better understanding. That was in the 1840 podcast program, or an associated article, I think. So with reference to the experience-driven realm of knowledge, these stories have been really alloyed with my own experience of my own spirituality or my identity, my soul's journey, its kind of loops and folds, its joys and its sorrows. So that said, I can't say that I'm not bringing some kind of analytical or literary critical mindset too, because I studied literature. I studied literature at Oxford in England, one short module on post-Holocaust literature with the brilliant Professor Colin Davis, who introduced me to Elie Wiesel, who actually also spoke. Elie Wiesel spoke at the Oxford Union that same year, back in the mid-1990s. And I studied Kafka with another teacher, my German teacher, in some detail. But from my own point of view as a community teacher who has taught writing, I've taught in prisons, I've taught in community education. These stories, I think, can provide a way of opening up this really yearned for space for self-development, but for another level of learning about the self as a soul. So from the beginning, the multi-dimensional element of the sources of the stories as they exist in the world today is really clear. And multi-dimensional could be a really fundamental word for the stories too. For Nahman of Uman's life, characters, and his view of life, what Orovis Kindelpa calls the prismatic character of Nahman, we can look at them from many different angles as we marvel at their light, just like the diamonds that appear in so many of his stories. So the first story that we will look at is what I call the diamond and grain story, otherwise known as a story of a pauper who supported himself by digging clay. And my approach with the stories is to write around and into them from our own unique place in the world today. So from our personal place here. And creative writing from the stories especially allows for that interaction, I think, between our own unique angle with the story. So I will connect them with aspects of contemporary life and culture, just as Nahman apparently did. And that is, after all, the kind of the setting for the dream. And a word on dreams. It's perhaps human nature, I think, to want to understand the stories. And that has led to all this kind of decoding that Elie Wiesel quite strongly condemns in his 1967 lecture. He didn't like interpretations, I think, which strictly decode, for example, the sisters to be aspects of the Kabbalistic Sephirot or the and I can agree to an extent with that, but I think the decoding is part of the puzzle. It's part of the learning. It can make the map for exploring the stories bigger. It can lead us off into all sorts of fascinating Kabbalistic sources and different sources from Torah. So, but as with reading the Torah itself, the link must absolutely be our own unique personal one, I think, to get the best from these readings. So therefore, if we take someone else's map and superimpose it, that probably won't work. So I don't think actually that the key is understanding. If anything, we can't understand. If I had to summarize my own approach to reading the stories, then it's to treat them like a dream. So as with many of the narratives, they have a dreamlike structure, leaving aside that they also contain stories of dreams. Motifs and characters morph within them as people and things often do in dreams. And as Wiesel says, there's no unity of time, place, and action. But we are also haunted by strong feelings as we read, which are both tied to and yet kind of slip away from the narrative or the events themselves. And certain details may stick in our mind, certain feelings. Those aspects, I think, are personal because they're associative with feelings and aspects of our own lives. And that is their power. So Ora Wiskindalpa wrote in her book, just quote, she said, Rabbi Nahman averred many times that his tales have the power to lead lost souls to repentance, to make barren women fertile, to heal blind eyes, and to restore somehow the unity of a shattered world. And Reb Noson, the follower responsible for ensuring the stories endured, we might say, he himself said, pause and admire these marvels. Deeply awed, you will read words so powerful that they will be your bridge to heaven. So let's begin. I would like to share the first writing exercise with you. For most of today, I've been speaking, but in subsequent meetings, we will have the chance to share writing and reading, and look at some other sources as well. So I will share this question also in the WhatsApp group and by email, but it would be, I think, fruitful if you could consider the question, what is your personal story of how you came to know Nahman from Aman's stories, or what is their place in your life story? And this could be a piece of flow writing. You know, it's not supposed to be a finished thoughts on the page, really, to share something of the place of these stories in your life. So we can begin that in a moment. Another thing that I would ask you to do, if you have time and if you have the ability to do it before we meet again next week, would be to watch a film. It's a film from our time called Searching for Sugar Man, unless you know it already. I'll share the title and the information in the links. It is a curious real story from secular life, which I think has many commonalities with a Breslov story, and it could be said to be of the kind of riches to rags or rags to riches genre, like the first story that we'll look at. But the information that I've just shared there about the writing exercise and about the suggested film to watch, I will certainly make sure that that's in the WhatsApp as well. So it's a great pleasure to meet you all. I don't know whether you'd like to say anything at this point or whether you'd like to just get started with the writing. I think what I'll do is I'll keep the camera on in case anyone has a question arising. I should note as well that I am recording, as I said in the emails, I'm recording these videos. I hope later on to edit and to share, you know, perhaps on YouTube or in some form or other like that. But you're all very warmly welcome. It's a great privilege to be able to share a discussion of these wonderful wise stories with you as a group. So what I'll do is I'll share to the WhatsApp now the question, and maybe you want to begin a little bit of writing now. If you want to share it with the group, then you can send it to the WhatsApp group, and we can look at them in our next meeting. And it would be great to do that, I think. Yeah. So let me see if I can copy it to you all. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to see on the WhatsApp group. At the top, there's the link to Sepharia that I mentioned. There are the new book that has been published this year by the Breslov organization, and the other book that I talked about, Ora Wiskindelpa's book. There's the link to Elie Wiesel's 1967 lecture. And if possible, watch the Searching for Sugarman film. Don't worry if you can't. There's also a trailer there that I've put in, which is just a few minutes. And the question at the bottom. So write and share. Send what you write to me on the WhatsApp or by email if you'd like to share with the group. And the question being, what is your personal story of how you came to know Nahman from Uman's stories? What is their place in your life story? So we'll just sit quietly for maybe 10 minutes while we write something. Okay. And if anyone has a question, feel free to ask. Welcome. Hello. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Welcome back. I hope all are well. We'll just wait a moment. We'll just give it a moment for people to join, and we'll get started. So
I'm
it's
going
good
to turn my
to welcome you.
camera off because my Mac overheats.
Okay. Yeah,
I'll give it a
that's
break and
okay.
then turn it back on. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so welcome. We'll just wait. We'll give it a minute or two for people to come on in. Okay, so welcome back to the second week of our Just one moment, I'll let in. That's it. Okay. So welcome everyone. It's good. It's good to be here again with you this evening. Welcome back. So I hope all are well. And yeah, if you need to put your camera on or off or whatever is good for you, okay. So last week I provided an introduction to this course of writing on Rabbi Nahman's stories. And I said a little about my own personal relationship with the stories. So I'd like to say thank you for contributions received on the writing exercise that we discussed at the end of the last class, namely, what is your personal story of how you came to know Nahman from Uman's stories, or what is their place in your life story? Any of the writing exercises are optional, of course, and you only share them if you wish to do so. But as noted from the beginning, I am recording these classes for future sharing, but I want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable with that. So what I intend for the moment is either that I will use the recording to produce an audio only, or I may just share my own speaking sections alone. So for today, whilst the recording button, I think, may stay on, in the second part of the class, we will use part of the time for me to give the opportunity to you to read or simply to share what came out of the writing exercise that I just mentioned. And I won't use that part of the recording where we're just discussing together, okay, which is equally important, but perhaps not for wider sharing because of the decision-making process that involves, which we don't want to spend time on that in the class, essentially. So for those of you who haven't read any of the stories by Rabbi Nahman yet, because I know that can also be the case, you might, in the second part, you might feel able instead just to say something about what attracted you to this group. We'll just have a little discussion on it afterwards, okay? So we are on the way to reading one of Rabbi Nahman's stories together. Our quest to explore his writing here has begun. But before we go into Nahman's rags to riches story, which is a story of a pauper who supported himself by digging clay, or I call it the diamond and grain story, next week. This week, let's look around for the genre, for some of the themes of the story, so that we can discover them for our own times, the times that we're living in. So first, regarding the genre, let me share my screen. So regarding the genre of this book, of this story, I think it could be called a rags to riches story. You can see one definition of the rags to riches genre on the screen. An ordinary, insignificant person, could be an orphan, could be dressed in rags, a humble little figure of a human, ignored and dejected, but they are somehow maltreated, regarded by those around as being of little worth. And this tiny person suddenly becomes center stage, where they have to go out into the world to face adventures. In the course of the story, it is dramatically shown that they are not actually normal at all. They've been hiding extraordinary talent. And given the chance to shine through the circumstances they find themselves in, they go on to do amazing things. However, just when all is going to plan, things go wrong. They have to use their talents to overcome these challenges. Eventually, they emerge from the shadows of obscurity into dazzling splendor. So some of these elements may be present in the story that we're going to read, as I say, next week. And we're just beginning to think really about what the story is about and what are the themes of the story. So last week I mentioned a quite amazing story from this rags to riches genre. I recommended the documentary, which is called Searching for Sugar Man. Could you put a sign in the chat or wave your hand, or did anyone manage to watch the documentary? No, okay. Well, I'll say a little more about it. Okay, and I know very much that we're here to, okay, one person did. Okay, good. So yeah, I know we're here to read the stories of Rabbi Nahman, but kind of following in his own spirit, I think he would discuss all sorts of things with people in order to connect with the times of his day, and in order to storytelling was enmeshed in his way of talking with others. And I came across this story quite recently, the documentary about this man Rodriguez. So I'll just share the trailer with you, okay? The trailer is 2 or 3 minutes long. So hopefully everyone can see the picture on the screen of the trailer, and you should be able to hear the sound as well. Let me play it.
If I had to name 10 artists that I've ever been involved with, Rodriguez would be in the top 5.
He's my most memorable artist.
Bob Dylan was mild to this guy.
He was this wandering spirit around the city. When he opened up and sang, you went, whoa, this guy's got it.
We expected big things, and they did absolutely nothing. How many records do you think he sold in America?
In America, 6.
Nobody had even heard of him. How can that be? How can that be?
It's a bit of a mystery how the first copy of Cold Fact came to South Africa, but to us, it was one of the most famous records of all time. He was the soundtrack to our lives.
Bigger than Elvis.
Much bigger than Rolling Stones.
Any revolution needs an anthem. The message it had was be anti-establishment. The first opposition to apartheid, they were influenced by Rodriguez.
Nobody knew anything about him. He was a mystery.
Then we found out that he had committed suicide.
The story differs a lot, and a lot of people have different versions of the story.
He set himself alight on stage.
He reached down and pulled up a gun and pulled the trigger. I thought it'd make a good story, find out how Rodriguez died.
So we started looking quite deeply at the lyrics.
And one day, just by accident, I found it. What I thought was the end of story was actually just the beginning, and the best part was still to come.
Said wanted, and have you seen this man? Matter of fact, I have seen him before.
Sounds like something you would make up if you were bragging on some dream or something.
It didn't work out, but don't ever doubt.
He's like a wise man, a prophet, way beyond just being a musical artist.
He had this kind of magical quality that all genuine poets and artists have. I think he's representative of the human spirit, of what's possible.
This is all too strange to be true. These are the days of miracles and wonder.
So it gives you a flavor of the film. Let me just turn off the moment, something that's still playing. Okay, yeah, it gives you a flavor of the film, and I want to just say a few more words about it as we work our way around and then into Rabbi Nahman's story. So the documentary film is about a singer, Rodriguez, who is I guess a bricklayer or an odd job man. He was living and working in Detroit in America in the 60s. And he just doesn't really make it as a singer there. The record producer in America says, I think in the film, that maybe 6 copies of his album were sold in the USA. His songs are recognized by his producers as being really good, but for whatever reason, he doesn't get the recognition, the success that he was predicted to get. You know, it's a flop. So he continues on with his job as a builder or home clearance, is having played in a few small bars, just the downtown scene in Detroit. And what happens then is that in South Africa, where there's the struggle against the segregation of blacks and whites apartheid, it's reaching its peak. A copy of Rodriguez's album, that's, you know, the singer in America, that reaches South Africa, and he becomes incredibly famous there, unbeknownst to him. His music becomes incredibly loved. It's the music of resistance, I guess, of revolution. It's mainly the whites who it seems to help them to stand in resistance to apartheid within a very controlling state. So they're listening to bootlegs of this music, and it becomes one of the ways of the young people to support freedom. It's like a massive phenomenon in South Africa. But there are then all these kinds of myths about Rodriguez there, which were mentioned in the trailer, that he killed himself, that things weren't going well for him, so he shot himself, he put a gun to his head on stage. Another story that he burnt himself alive, he killed himself that way. And there's this kind of unquestioning acceptance that there's no point trying to find out more about what happened to him. He's just thought to have died this horrible death away in America, as I guess many rock and roll stars have. But at some point, there's a small article in a music magazine questioning, where did he come from? What was his story? And one journalist or investigator who loved his music decides to just try to answer this question. How did Rodriguez die is the question that he begins with. And as he goes through the lyrics of all the songs very carefully, very painstakingly, he's trying to find out where he was. He has all sorts of leads. He has places mentioned in the lyrics. And eventually, that's that Rabbi Nahman word again from last week, he tracks down a producer who worked with him, who's a huge name, who'd worked with Michael Jackson, but that doesn't lead him to Rodriguez. So he ends up putting up adverts. He creates a website saying, I'm looking for information about this person. He doesn't think he's looking for the singer, the living singer, because he's believed to be dead, but he wants to find out what happened to him, how he died. And finally, it's his daughter, who you saw in the trailer, the singer's daughter, who gets in touch with, I think by now there are 2 investigators or journalists together on this trail that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And first they follow the money, but that doesn't really help with their quest, because most of the copies in South Africa seem to have been illegal, bootleg copies, not really generating, any royalties. The music wasn't being played on radio. It was prohibited by the state in South Africa. So this also leads to dead ends. But in the end, it's the daughter who says, that's my father. And of course, he's not dead. He did die last year. So he died in 2023. And I will share, if you're interested, a link to his obituary article, which says a bit more about his story. But actually, the singer has just continued on living the life that he lived before. He had really no knowledge that he'd gone platinum in South Africa, and his album had become like the anthem of a generation of people resisting apartheid, claiming freedom. So they track him down. He's an unassuming kind of humble guy, really, going about his hard, dirty job of stripping out old paintwork, gutting old buildings. He's had a very working class life. His daughters in the film speak very highly of him, saying, he was involved with workers' rights struggles throughout their childhood. He made sure that at the weekends they went out to see the world, museums, libraries, to show them, that there was more of a world outside, as it were. He still plays the guitar. He's still musical. But all his life has been revolving around the building trade, the dirty work. So they bring him to South Africa and he performs. It's 30 years later now. They organized a band for him. They organized the venues, and it's a sellout. The passion for him and what he, represents to the South African people is palpable in the film. As he walks out with confidence, but with this humility out of his mundane life, where he really hadn't got an inkling of making it as a singer, and he's suddenly, an absolute megastar with these vast audiences in South Africa. So I don't know, as I'm speaking, or one of you has also seen the film, whether you would find resonances with Rabbi Nahman's writing, because I guess I do. So I think that there are themes and commonalities with Rabbi Nahman's stories. Would anyone like to contribute, or if not, I can share my thoughts. You can speak, you can write in the chat. If not, we'll discuss more towards the end. But I guess the elements of the story that
Oh,
Yes.
can I say something?
Yeah.
The thing that the difference that's in a way what I noticed in rereading the story of the man who found the pearl is the role of chance, that things are good or bad, but it's really a matter of chance, of coincidence. That he gets the pearl, and then he gets this trip, and then he loses the pearl, and then he loses and the pearl's thrown out, and he falls asleep. But then he gets the wheat, and then becomes, well, things go well. So there's like, first there's a pearl, and then there's wheat. So it's like a different kind of, I'm not sure what it means, but I think in that story, it's so much the role of chance in the rags to riches journey. There's really not, I couldn't really see carefully enough what more about the man and what he did, or choices that he made, beyond that.
Yeah, and that is the story that we're going to read next week, the one that you're talking about. So
I thought that was
yeah,
for today. Oh, I thought that was
well,
for today.
We're working up to it, and we are discussing it, I guess, but we're going around, and
Oh,
we're not
okay.
going directly into the reading of it today, but next week, we
Okay.
are talking about it, and it is that story that I'm thinking about that's in the forefront of my mind when so this is these chance encounters, these twists of fate, it seems, at first sight. So, they find the daughter of this man, who maybe nobody else has been looking for. And, why haven't they been looking for him? Because they heard these stories, and it's a very complicated web of things that happens. Yeah. And I think as well, like we spoke last week about Elie Wiesel, who said in his lecture that there's no unity of time, action, and place, or very little in Rabbi Nahman's stories. There's one story, of one man in one place, and there's another of a people, in another place. So, in this film, there's the guy who's in America, and he's continuing on with his daily life. In another place, he is a megastar. He doesn't know it, but in another space, he is part of a completely different narrative, really. So there's also a quest, I think, or several colliding quests. So there's the individual man's quest to be a singer, and he really wants, I think, to be a singer for the ordinary person, dreaming of a better life. His lyrics, it's a quest for his voice to be heard. That's the way it seems to me. There's also a people's quest for freedom from the system of social subjugation. And there's the touching quest of these investigators, these truth seekers, if you like, who are trying to find out about the singer, which ultimately, seemingly by chance, brings the two together. Yeah. And so, the people do meet the man, as it were. So I know that, music has a very special place in the traditions in which Rabbi Nahman belonged, in Hasidism itself, and prior, in the tribe of Levi. And it is a very special gift. And this man clearly had, an incredible gift for music. It seemed to be totally unrecognized for years, and in one place. And then he does maintain, though, I guess, his self-belief. Like, he continues playing the guitar, and he continues on, with his life, with his day job, whether or not he has any kind of intuition in his heart that in another realm his mission to sing for freedom and to be the voice of the people is being achieved, whether he does or he doesn't. And so I guess he doesn't fall prey to disillusionment. He does become a much loved singer, whose lyrics are heard.
There's another theme, which is that these people, these like storytellers, need some other people to find them and tell their stories. Same with Kafka, same with Rabbi. I did listen to the Elie Wiesel lecture, and I think he that Nahman had, an apostle. He didn't want his work to be burned. He wanted it to be told, but he had to rely on his disciples to tell it. And we don't, Kafka obviously was very hesitant to publish things in his lifetime. So we all, rely on his editors and translators and Max Brod and this guy Sugarman also. Like, there had to be someone to he hid away. And there's something about the hiddenness, of these stories and the storytellers that, they're not the publicists. In other words, they tell secret stories and they're hidden, but it's for the world to find them.
Yes, I love the way that you put that. Yeah, this kind of chance meetings, people appearing in disguise, people appearing who actually their reality is quite hidden, and we have to uncover it. Yeah. I think that was beautifully put. And this hero on his journey, he is immersed in the mundane as well. He is living a dirty day job. His head is not really in the clouds, I suppose, in one sense. But on the other level, he's the archetypal dreamer. He's dreaming of this music, the singing, the freedom of the people. And his dream somehow is connected with, the masses of people in South Africa. So then also another theme, I'm kind of throwing them all out there at once, but there's a very important state of readiness to being called, I think. So the hero in this story, he's not taken aback when he's called to be himself before thousands, to do what he was destined to do, really, to sing before thousands, despite really the apparent lack of preparation. I mean, he hasn't been a professional singer for decades. He hasn't got a band. I don't know about stage practice, but he's ready to receive this mission. He's going to switch from this mundane work that he's been doing to this work of, aligning different spheres almost. And the images in the film are really images of love at this point. He walks out to a loving crowd. So that's a beautiful image, which I guess, we can think of as a kind of messianic trajectory. But it is also about the individual's journey. He does go from rags to riches in a sense, like Breslov's heroes, like Nahman Breslov's heroes, from pauper to prince, or from rooster to king. He is in disguise in a way, but our focus isn't really on his personality, but we witness the coming together of these different stories. And apparently, as you say, because there was a truth seeker, there was an investigator who was looking, well, what happened to him? And just not accepting the fact, I guess, that a lot of others had accepted that he was dead and gone. That was the narrative. He died a horrible, ugly death. Let's not turn to find out what happened, but he wants to know. Two journalists, two investigators, they want to know what happened. And what we then witness is this coming together of disunited personal and collective elements, which seem to be so separate before, really. And it's the fulfillment of individual hopes, but it's the fulfillment of group hopes as well. It's definitely part of something much bigger than all these chance meetings and chance events would foretell, I suppose. So I think that's why I found this film. I was chatting away with the master of the universe and saying, well, there must be a story, like a more modern, and then I found this film and I was like, wow, this film is so resonant with Rabbi Nahman's stories. So it reminds me of the Master of Prayer story, and definitely it reminds me of the Rabbi's Son story as well, which you mentioned, one of you, where there's this struggle for unity. And that's dependent on meetings. It's dependent on meetings which seem to be maybe quite insignificant, but turn out to be, enormously, cosmically significant for the coming of the Mashiach. So I'm getting a message here that we have 10 minutes left, okay, of the meeting time. Once again, I'll be sharing a writing exercise, which you may wish to look at, during the week or in the next half an hour of the evening. So the writing exercise that I suggest, and I will also share this as usual on the different messaging forums, is either you could write about a rags to riches or riches to rags moment in your life. Okay, so this could be about finding something valuable or losing something of value. You know, metaphorically speaking, when have you become wealthy? Could be inner wealth, could be something valuable comes your way, or when have you lost something? Because that's the theme of the diamond and grain story that we'll consider next week. You know, whether monetary or more on a spiritual, on a soul kind of level, losing or finding something. And one creative writing technique for telling that story would be, if you wish, you can tell it in the third person. You know, sometimes when we avoid writing I, we write he or she. We can just distance ourselves a little from the story, and it's just a narrative technique that I suggest you could experiment with. Or if you want to choose a less autobiographical option, so I don't know anything about Rodriguez's religion. I don't know about his religion at all. If he had beliefs, I don't know about them. But as a creative writing, imaginative exercise, you could write a prayer or a meditation, imagining what Rodriguez said in his moments alone before he learned that his songs were listened to in South Africa. So when he thinks, you know, I've sold 6 copies and that is it, you know. So how did he think about this? Was he feeling resignation, rebellion, hope? Just to imagine. Okay, so those are 2 suggested writing exercises. But for the rest of the class time together today, few minutes, would anyone like to share something, either read what you sent to me, or to share something about how you came to know Rabbi Nahman's stories, or why you were attracted to learn about them in this class, or anyone? And as I say, this part won't be, we're just discussing amongst ourselves now. This won't be part of any future edited recording that's shared.
I'll go for it.
Okay.
Okay, so hi first, because I didn't introduce myself, but you see my name. I'm Ora Simcha. So Rabbi Nahman is my Rebbe, so that's a little preface to what I'll write. And I go often to Uman, so I'll say it was a little daunting and also exhilarating to have the challenge of trying to put in words what the stories mean to me. Because it's a very deep treasure, but I'll just share. I think it's something I could come back to, but here's just like the little of the start. So Rabbi Nahman said that most stories put people to sleep, but his stories wake people up. And storytelling is a lost art, as the ancient storytellers feel like they get further away from our generation. These stories are the driving force in my essence, and I carry them with me as deep treasures. They're very unknown in their healing capacity. I have only begun to explore these motifs, the limits, the bridge to Gan Eden or to heaven that Reb Nassan told us about. The world is in a very deep need for waking up, and it's a time that I yearn, and it is time I yearn. I also yearn to hear these stories directly from the mouth of Rabbi Nahman, from the righteous one. Sometimes I feel orphaned without this direct experience, and my soul is calling out for these explorations, for these mysteries within myself, like the story within myself. Where is there to run free within these tales, as I feel like they're playful? How can I dream, and how can I kind of touch every corner of them, every word of them? How can I gaze at them or through them without the analytical mind? I dare to venture and to open my heart to what will now be shown. One of my hopes has always been to paint on my future children, God willing, my future children's walls, to paint these stories for them to grow up with and to bring these stories to life, so that my children can also like wake up and go to sleep with them and live with them. And to allow them to cradle us and me in deep wonder, as Rabbi Nahman was called also like Ish Pele, a man of wonder. And then I wrote at the end, can they be found among us in these stories and all the paths that I walk? Do they touch every aspect of both the spiritual and physical reality that's see.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Aura. Yeah, I see the Leslie's question in the chat there saying, can I please come back as your child because of that beautiful image of the paintings? Yeah, that was a beautiful piece of writing. I think everyone is nodding, and yeah, it was amazing, Aura. Thank you so much for sharing. And where you use the word treasure, you said what a treasure the stories are, and I really feel that in teaching these classes I'm kind of offering the crown jewels really of Judaism, or of the tradition, you know, of the Kabbalistic tradition of Hasidism. And you know, as I explained last week, I can't rationalize exactly how I've come to be in this particular place of having such a great honor. But I loved the fact that you also thought of them as a treasure, and they are so very powerful in their richness and in their wealth. Yeah. So we do have to finish now because I've already gone a little bit over the 30 minutes, and I want to give you time for your individual writing. If you want to share anything with the group in terms of pieces that you've written, as I say, send it to me on the WhatsApp. We will read as much as we can as well in the meetings together, but you can also send the writing so that it can, and just tell me, I want this to be shared with the others, please. Okay, so if you already sent me something and you'd like me to share that, or in the future, just send me a message and I'll make sure that it's shared with everyone in the group. Okay. Thank you so much. It was beautiful to finish with your reading, Aura. Thanks so much. I'll see you next week. Okay.
Thank you.
Hello. Hello. Hello, welcome. Hello. Hi. Welcome. So we'll just give it a minute or two because there's one more person who may be joining. So yeah, it's good to see you. I hope you're doing well. Yeah.
How are you doing?
How am I doing? Well, I'm normally working from one piece of paper, and this class I have like 4 or 5, so that's how I'm doing. And this is I think my 8th hour of teaching today. Yeah, 8th. So yeah, I'm teaching. How are you doing?
Well, I'm not teaching in the summer, so I get a break. So I'm just working. I have a lot of work to do, but the one thing I don't do is teach right now, which is nice.
Yeah.
I get a break.
Switch to learning for a while, but they do
Switch
say
to learning, exactly.
teaching is learning. Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah. And yeah, anyone else say hello if you want to, or it's up to you. But it's really good to see you. Yeah, good to see you. So I think I'll get started. And again, I'm going to speak, you know, for part of the class, and then there's an opportunity to share writing as well. And it was really nice, I think, to listen to some of the shared writing last week. So if anyone wants to do that this week, but if not, we can just discuss. Yeah, I think this week I went to donate a copy of the book that I wrote a year ago to the Jews in Lyon, where I live in France. And yeah, so many things really. I have a sort of lot of notes here, I guess. Yeah, I guess that I've given my book that I wrote to the National Library of Israel. It was self-published a year ago, and it was an autobiographical story of trauma and mystical relationship, actually. And then, you know, I was teaching and I was trying to teach Torah, even though, so I mean, I'm not going to say trying, because I think to have some confidence is Nahman from Uman's is his lesson to us. So I was teaching Torah rather than I was trying to teach Torah. But, you know, I'm working in the public school system, which is laïque in France, which means no religion, nothing religious. So that's, you know, a challenge to teach Torah, to teach the teaching in that system. And then I'm teaching online, sometimes very small children, 4 years old, 5 years old, but online. And so it was an interesting week, as many weeks are. And then dreams, and I really picked up on what you said last week, one of you, about truth seeking. And you know, these stories, can we think of them as truth seeking? And then I think on another level, there is receipt, you know, there is receipt of truth. And we are so small, we are so small, and there's so much fear of that experience, you know, even terror. But something that's always, you know, well, I say always, I think it's comforted me for as long as I can remember, was Jeremiah, you know, for I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. And just to hold that, you know, to hold that in mind, and also to hold in mind, you know, just that wherever you are, because, you know, in the depths of these dreams of terror, and real terror, we can say to God, whatever we've done, you know, confess, repent, but wherever we are, we can say, here I am. And that, yeah, so it was a week of dreaming and struggling and learning and into now teaching. So let me try to organize my papers. I think that we will begin by perhaps reading the story together, but I do really like this video. Let me just share the possibly one of you will know this one, because you said you'd been to Uman quite a lot, so you may already know this. Let me show I won't play the video now, but I'll just share the screen. So this one, is I don't know if you know it, but the story is told, recounted without a book in hand, between these two, and they're in Uman and they're just meeting up. It's really, they're chatting together, and this is the channel that they've provided, you know, with telling lots of the stories. So let me see if I can just show Rabbi Nahman's stories. So they're really great videos, and telling the stories just amongst each other, in the cold city. Apparently, but it looks very snowy in the picture of Uman. Yeah. I don't know if either of you know them already, but I really appreciated that recording. I'll share it later on in the links that I'm gonna share. Okay. So perhaps I'll read. Let's do that. Let me just share the correct screen here. Okay. All right, so I'll read, and of course we noted in the first meeting together that there are so many different versions, you know, in written format of the stories, but this is the one that I have here. So, a story of a pauper who supported himself by digging clay. A story our teacher told. A story of a pauper who supported himself from digging clay to sell. Once he was digging clay, and he found in the place that he dug a gem that looked like it was worth a lot of money, but he didn't know its value. So he went to a merchant for an estimation of its value, and this merchant told him, no one here can pay its value. For that, you would need to travel to London, to the royal city. But he was poor and he did not have money to travel. So he went and sold everything he had to get money. And he went from house to house for donations until finally he had enough to travel to the sea. He wanted to board the ship, but he didn't have money. So he went to the captain and showed him the gem. And immediately the captain took him aboard the ship with great honor and was content that the man would pay his way once he reached London. The captain gave him a special first-class cabin and treated him like a rich man. His cabin had a window into the sea, and he was always delighting and rejoicing his soul with the diamond. And especially at meal times, with joy and an expansive heart, he watched it sparkling with light. One day he sat to eat, and the diamond was resting on the table to be delighted with, and he slept. Meanwhile, the servant came and took the tablecloth and the crumbs and shook the tablecloth out to sea, throwing the diamond out with it. And when the man awoke from his sleep and he understood all this, he had such anguish, he nearly went out of his mind. What could he do? For he knew the captain to be a brutal thief who would kill him for the price of the trip on the ship. And the custom of the captain was to speak with him every day for a few hours. So he came on this day, and the man continued to act happy to the extent that the captain did not recognize any change in him. Then the captain said to him, I know that you're a wise and honest man, and I want to buy a lot of grain to sell in London, and I can profit handsomely, but I'm worried that they might think I stole it. Therefore, the purchase will be in your name, and I will pay you well. The man agreed, hoping he might still then be able to pay for his trip. Immediately upon their arrival in London, the captain died, and everything was left by this man, and it was worth many times more than the value of the diamond. Our teacher concluded about the man that the diamond was not his. The vision of this was not his because it went from him. The proof is that it was lost from him, and the grain was his. And the proof is that this vision, remained by him. So I'm really interested to discuss this story with you, and I think that everyone will have a unique interpretation of this and what it means probably. But I was making a few notes several months ago when I first began teaching just to one individual, actually, this series of classes, and I guess I was thinking partly about, what does it mean, the diamond? What does the grain mean? What does it mean that one is lost and the other is found? And I got thinking, first of all, about the value of the two. So I will make this more of an open discussion in a moment, I promise. But I just wanted to begin with a few thoughts that I think even now my thoughts will have changed and will have transformed over time. But I Googled, and of course we get answers from artificial intelligence these days if we put a question into the search engine, and this came up generated by a robot. So it said, if diamonds were as common as coal and coal was as rare as diamonds, it is likely that our perceptions of the two materials would be very different from what they are today. Material value is often influenced by scarcity, beauty, and utility, among other factors. In this hypothetical scenario, where coal is rare and diamonds are common, it is possible that coal would indeed be highly valued for its scarcity and unique properties, despite its less visually appealing appearance compared to diamonds. So I guess I agreed with part of what the robot said, and I didn't agree with other parts of it, but I did think that this was an interesting way of looking at the value and the value of something. If all coal was diamonds, and it reminded me of there's a poem by William Blake, the English poet, where he says, he quotes from Torah, but he's changed it in his own poem and says, would that all, it is the quote, would that all the Lord's people be prophets. And he transforms that in his poem to say, in the Messianic age, we'll all be able to see, we'll all be prophets. And it's obviously that story of Moses being told that there are two prophesying outside the tent, and should he exclude them or should he allow them to speak? And he allows them to speak and said, would that all the Lord's people be prophets? So I think, the diamond is potentially this transformation of the coal into something of great worth, or to the blind person, who just weighs it in their hands. My family were miners, by the way, several of the family were lost in the mines, or if they weren't lost, they were disabled. And And it's also something solid and material in which the light now appears. So in this sense, you know, it can be Torah. And as a gift, it's something that the protagonist maybe didn't have to work for. But I think from my own sort of personal mystical relationship, I think maybe the diamond is supraconsciousness, it's inner light, it's reminiscent of the things that we can see through, like the window stone in Noah's Ark, or like the, if I pronounce this correctly, the Urim and Tumim, and the lights to guide. And whereas perhaps the grain possibly represents, you know, the work of generations, either in material labor, community study, to pass on this inheritance, or does the grain mean grace, that you don't work for something, but it's given to you? You know, how do we receive? Do we work very hard? Do we toil, or do we just receive, or is it both? Yeah. So he continued, I think, walking in the faith of providence, even in loss, even under threat. And that's a hugely inspiring story. Nobody outside could actually tell him the value of this diamond. So it was his mission to get it valued. And that was thwarted because nobody could tell him. And he had to find the value of it potentially maybe within himself, which he only found via losing it. Or of course, that in the end, he had not only the beautiful memories of how it had sparkled in the light, but it also took him on his journey towards a much greater inheritance than he imagined when he found the truth, the vision, and the light in this world of clay digging. So that points us then back to human effort, to growing crops, to toiling on the land, to harvesting, which maybe leaves a kind of confusion or a kind of openness to the story. I also read on the Chabad website, it's I'm just going to quote from this. It says, a number of well-known legends surround Rashi's birth and life. Rashi's father, Rabbi Yitzhak, was a diamond merchant. Once he came into possession of a spectacular gemstone that the church wanted as a centerpiece for a statue. Despite much pressure and promises of incredible sums of money, Rabbi Yitzhak refused to sell the diamond. And when church officials lured him onto a boat and threatened him with death if he refused to sell, only then did Rabbi Yitzhak agree to part with the precious stone. While standing on deck, he took it out as if to give it to them. Then craftily, he faked tripping. When the stone slipped out of his hand and into the water, a heavenly voice proclaimed, "You gave up a material diamond for my honor, and you will receive a spiritual diamond in its place." So there's so much richness and wealth to this story. I'd like to open up the discussion now. I mean, we don't have to focus on the question of what is the diamond, what is the grain. Maybe you want to share something from what you wrote after last week's class, or something different.
Yeah, I noticed, thank you. That was beautiful as always. I noticed just taking one story or a couple, I'll just start with one, like in the Master of Prayer, another one of Rabbi Nahman's stories. So there's like this, and like many stories, like leaving the place of origin, going out. So like that's similar, like lech lecha, go to yourself. Like in essence, going to get the diamond priced or finding the worth of it is also like going out to search for oneself. And then having it just so quickly change, meaning it being thrown away or being like averted by a servant who comes along and throws it away, is kind of like, I see it as just events that occur naturally or supernaturally, and then they throw us off course. And that place, something I've learned very deeply from Rabbi Nahman's teachings is that no matter what, like ein shum yeush, there's no despair. And so when we really internalize that lesson, like everything has its natural course of events, and here often with that type of grace or patience, something else is revealed. So there's like a deep patience and a discovery of self, I think, and just leaving the place of origin, what's known to me, to go out and seek something different. And we talked about the motif of like rags to riches, and I was thinking about how often there can be riches to rags, as well as we see in the Exchange Children, another story that it's just this like constant exchanging that's happening. So whether it's the grain for the diamond or diamond for the grain, or there it's the king and the servant, or it's the place that I come from, I'm a king, but now I'm out and wandering and I have no home, or in many of the stories. So that's a little bit of what I'm thinking, and I'll let someone else share.
Yeah, that was a really generous sharing, and yeah, I really appreciated all that you said there, and just especially this kind of process of looking, or you mentioned a lot of strong nouns like being patient or looking as well, and this can be happening on a natural or supernatural in the different realms, really, I guess, that Nahman was so good at as showing that they all exist together, really, in our own journey through life. And the Master of Prayer, I don't know if that one, I hope I'm going to do some teaching on that soon, because I think it's just so apt for our times. Like, people are talking, there's a lot of conspiracy theory about this kind of great reset, or there's a very it has to be called fascist discourse, I think, in Europe, about a big replacement, the great replacement of leaders, by, I don't know, when we look at what's happening on a spiritual level, we can see that Nahman described a much different trajectory. So yeah, the king is out, in the field or lost, or but all the people are looking, and finally they find this again, they find this again, they find this again, and there's a transformation that happens that is and what interested me in that story as well was that the people who are the kings and the queens in the society, after the loss, as it were, they do terrible things, like they're the king because they are the king of murdering, or they're the queen because they're the queen of, I don't know, drug taking or something. But later on, those same characters, they are still the same characters, but they are part of the redemption, and they're found, or they find themselves perhaps, and there's this big replacement, to use the word that I would never use in its context that it's used in politics today. Yeah. So hopefully we can talk more about that one.
So I
Abigail, yeah.
I won't I don't want to repeat, a lot of things that you said are very, very very interesting and right to me. And you're both, I think, more experienced in reading these stories than I am. And, in a weird way, I'm reading I'm from Kafka backwards. And I thought of a story called Give It Up, a very short story. And I won't go into it. You guys might want to look at it, but what I wondered reading back from that story is the impulse to find its value by asking other people. Is that like a sort of a negative? Is that a mistake? With Kafka, Kafka's characters often, like, instead of kind of looking inward, when you look outward and ask too many people for, explain to me this, and what's my value, and how do I get there, and what do I do? That usually leads to lack of self-confidence. And so one question is, do you think in this story that's a negative? And then maybe the evidence of that is that he falls asleep and losing it. And also many narratives of education, when you fall asleep, you lose something. In Pilgrim's Progress, actually, he falls asleep and loses his scroll, right? So when you fall asleep, it's generally not a good thing. And he loses the diamond because he falls asleep. So, but I don't know if that would be decoded that way in this kind of story. And
Yeah, may I just respond to the first
Sure.
question that if that's okay, because I think that's really interesting. Like, I guess I don't want to use the word should when I'm asking a question, but like, should we turn outside for our answers, or should we look purely within? And I suppose there's so much popular psychology these days that you should just look within, but that is often ignorant of a conversation with God, with Hashem, which for myself is, the cornerstone of finding yourself. And for Rabbi Nahman as well, it was a dialogue. And, Elie Wiesel, who I know you're studying, it was very much an impassioned dialogue, and even an argument at times. And but I think that question for me probably brings me often to the book of Job, whereby he's very lonely when he's asking his questions, about why am I in this situation? Why am I, why have I lost everything? And nobody around him is really able to give, I mean, they're just not able to give the adequate explanation. And maybe he feels that, like the one in Kafka who's transformed into the beetle, at the end, he feels that'll be his destiny, because he feels he must have done something terribly wrong to have suffered such loss. And then with the conversation with God.
It's not exactly that. He says, I didn't do anything wrong. Job says, no,
yes,
what his friends are telling him. Said, you did something wrong. God is just. Everything happens for a reason. They give him all the cliches of what people are told when they go through a hard time. And he says, no, that is not me. You are not hearing me. Those don't. And he says, none of you guys, understand. And he waits and waits and waits until, he gets, God, a vision from God. So it's a little different.
But I think he does kind of want to say, have I done something terribly wrong that I'm not aware of? I think that was what I was trying to say. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, Bildad and the others, they're saying to him, well, you must have done, because this is obviously karma. And he's saying, well, no, I haven't, but so he doesn't understand. And then but at the end of the interesting part, maybe at the end, I think, is that the brothers and sisters who weren't mentioned before, they're all there again. So again, like in the Master of Prayer, there's maybe this idea of, everything is gone, really. And I honestly think that is the mystical experience to some extent. Like I don't want to talk too much about my own personal trajectory in this particular class, but I was kind of proud, maybe too proud, but I was feeling a kind of joy that I'd finished writing my book. The next day I was struck with paralysis, and I lost most of the movement in my body. They thought I'd had a stroke, etc. And like Job, I was calling to God, saying, well, is that it then? You're done with me now, because I've and of course that was only the beginning. Of course that was the very beginning. But this process of whether to ask for help or not, I think, is very, very delicate, because even then, like I knew I needed quite a lot of help at that point, I needed to pray, but I needed help. So I was asking probably within myself. I found a book. I'd never read really the Talmud methodically. I don't know. I am a non-Jew, as you know. I at the moment I'm not converted. so I was reading around bits and pieces, but I went into a bookstore in a very rural place where there wouldn't be any Jews living there, and there was a commentary on the Talmud, and I just started flicking through it, and it was as if the page said to me, consult this person about your illness. And I went, and they healed me. And then this was a beginning of like, I'd been in the hospital. The hospital has said, right, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to do the other. Like Nahman of Breslov, the doctors. I think that's the part of Nahman of Breslov I've taken upon myself, as well as some other amazing gifts. But he didn't like doctors, did he? But I found someone that I needed to go to for healing once I'd been to the hospital, and they were very kind to me in the hospital. That was just, so I don't think it's like you should not consult people outside yourself, do you?
Ora, what do you think?
Yeah, we only have a few more minutes, and I feel our discussion is just beginning. Do you want to say something else, and we can pick up again next week, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm just fascinated by what was both shared by both of you, and soaking in that. I just know recently, like I was just trying to think, one of the deepest pains that I felt recently was being misunderstood in a time that I wanted to be really understood. And the person said, "Oh," I said, "Oh, I'm experiencing this." And they said, "Well, you're always experiencing that." And I said, "Oh, I think you confused me with someone else." And there was such an emotional reaction of sensitivity and being misunderstood like I had never experienced before. But it was also from the misidentification that was coming outside when I was so earnestly trying to be heard, find my own identity, for a number of reasons. And it was a very sensitive topic, whether it's relationship, health, all these things. So I felt that recently. And so it's just probing me to ask more questions about that process. And like you said, I think it's really about having that dialogue and having that be the cornerstone, and then going forward from there.
Yeah. Actually, I don't know if you know Tamar Tabak, but she runs do you know her maybe? She she has had an amazing sort of series of lectures or talks or for women, the Rise series, and I listened, I think last year, to one of those, which was very much saying, if you have this anger at maybe someone, just try and convert your anger into a question to God, to say, well, express it to God. So, I feel you don't understand me, and then you'll realize that underneath that there is a gift. And it's a complex, thing to, like a diamond, it's a little complex to explain, to put before someone that as a way of proceeding. But I think that there's a lot of truth in that as well, to kind of change your question around. So it's, I feel misunderstood. Why are you making me feel this way? And then underneath that, there might be an answer.
Can I say one more thing about this story? I think that the fact that he starts out in the clay, and the clay is very earthy, modest, humble, right? And then he finds a gem, and it leads him to, as you said, to quest for something higher, something more. He doesn't have to be digging downward. He can be looking upward and outward, and then he meets these he goes house to house. Then he goes to the captain, who treats him like a rich man that he isn't. And then he's in the sea, where he's like experiencing nature and water. And then there's a servant who in 1 minute changes his whole destiny, and because of one moment he wasn't paying attention and throws out the diamond. But then the captain, who's a bad man, becomes a good man, and gives him the grain. And then he's again in nature. He's again connected to something that is organic, right? It's not the diamond. The diamond is like a little bit of a false. It's like a mystical, radiant, but also a little bit false. And it gets him a little into trouble. But when he gets the grain, he's back with something that is, as he says, is his. The diamond, like as Rabbi Nahman says, was not his. It could not be his. It was not going to be his, but it gets him to the grain, which is like not as mystical as the diamond. It's like a more ordinary thing, right?
Yeah, and I think as well, like this does, they all operate on so many levels, the stories. And I think, like, when I used to teach more writing for self-development. Now I'm kind of thinking more about, the journey that we have of the soul through life. But I still work on the self, of course. And we used to write this in prisons when I taught, and in the community, this alternative CV, like, okay, not your school grades, not your industry work, your job, but the struggles you've had in your life, you know, what has made you, what has broken you, what has, you know, made you the person that you are. And what I really love about this story is, you know, what did he say to the other people who were digging clay in the fields? Did he just say, I found this diamond, I'm off to try and find its value? You know, how did he, it was a massive disruption to his normal, as it were, ordinary, you know, life, presumably, that he found this thing. So there is that aspect, and I think that's a bit like the story of the Jewish people, you know, if I may say so, but it's not exactly like the story of other nations, because the Jewish nation has this kind of alternative CV, you know, what is happening here is also happening there. But I won't say more on that now. I think we have to finish, but I'll send some suggested writing exercises, and I hope we can pick up again next week. Thanks so much for coming.
But
yeah,
what are we
see you
reading
soon.
next? What are we reading for next week?
So, if you could read the is sometimes called The Rabbi and His Only Son, or The Rabbi's Only Son, and it has different titles, but I'll send a link to it both to the WhatsApp and also to the email. Okay, so I hope you can find a copy if you find it on the link. If not, okay, see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
So welcome everyone to this week's class, and I'm sorry that I'm not sharing this with video, but it's because I'm traveling. So yeah, you can probably hear some noises in the background. You might hear a few seagulls and other noises because I'm traveling at the moment, and I had to travel at the last minute, so that's why. So I'd like to read with you two stories which are actually very different in the way that they're told, but which both deal with the themes of tradition, law, and miracles. And this one for today's class is The Rabbi's Only Son. And then the second, hopefully, will be studied in our second series of classes. That's The Fly and the Spider. So The Rabbi's Only Son is said to be less fantastic or more realistic tale than the other stories. It does have supernatural themes, and it does have the elements of travel and a dream, and it is clearly infused with Kabbalistic teaching. But there is a more straightforward plot, and there's more unity of time, action, and place that we don't find in the other stories. So maybe, as some have said, this less fantastic or even more simple story was written this way because it contained Nahman's most overt political statement to the at times apparently disunited Jews of his times. It's possible to read it that way, but the teaching in the story is definitely not confined to one particular political moment of disunity within past history, unless that moment is repeatedly recurring. So I'm going to share in the links a recording of The Rabbi's Only Son, which, like many of Nahman from Uman's stories, is known by other names and titles too. Sefaria titles it The Rabbi and His Only Son. Before we look at how this story teaches us about tradition, law, and miracles, before we look at how Nahman is teaching about the redemption, let's ask a question about a hidden figure in this story. That is, the adversary, and where is he in the tale? The Arnold Band translation uses Samael for this figure. I've also said the devil, and Elie Wiesel in his lectures, which I referenced in the last classes, calls him Satan. And a second link that I'm going to share for you is Elie Wiesel's lecture on Satan, which really it comprises of many, many questions about who this character is in Jewish thought. In looking at where the adversary is in The Rabbi's Only Son, we need to look at least three levels on which this story can be read. First, the personal level. Second, the social or political level. Third, the spiritual or messianic level. On the personal level, I did read of some very ungenerous readings, to put it euphemistically, considering this story to be autobiographical, and conjecturing about the death of Rabbi Nahman's own son as a punishment to him, and his personal regret at failing to bring Mashiach because of a prideful nature. Well, I don't want to dwell on such ungenerous readings. So on the personal level, the adversary can be seen in the father's pride and prejudice. He doesn't want his son to see the tzaddik, a wise man, a holy teacher, that the son feels deeply that he needs to see, because the tzaddik is, in the father's eyes, deemed to be of inferior status, in terms specifically both of his scholarship and his family lineage. This pride and prejudice is the father's own internal evil inclination, Yetzer hara, or his hidden agenda throughout the story, and it expresses itself in his attempts to control his son's spiritual path throughout life. It isn't clear whether this is from malevolent intention or a cruel nature on the father's part, or because of the father's own misguided deference to what he may have been taught and heard about the tzaddik from others, even from an over-exaggerated sense of protection. But anyway, the result is the same. Because of the father's pride and prejudice, he doesn't want the son to see the tzaddik, and he teaches that every mishap on their journey towards that place is a sign from heaven that the journey is not meant to be. So what about the political level next? As I mentioned, some have read this story to be a political comment by Rabbi Nahman on the divisions within Judaism of his day. This is the early 19th century. Here, the father has been understood to be the conservative, non-Hasidic Jews, somehow the old guard of Judaism, whilst the son of a younger generation, talking to his peers rather than his elders for advice in the tale, could represent the revolutionary nature of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov's movement, then 2 generations old. Based on those readings which see a binary between the father and son, it is the supposedly more conservative or traditional figure in the story who falls prey to nothing less than idolatry. The adversary operates here through superstition and fake news. If the horse falls down, if the journey doesn't proceed without problems, and it's a sign that the journey is not ordained by God. If the axles break, God is telling them not to proceed. If a merchant slanders the tzaddik, it's a sign that the journey to see him should not go ahead. All of the deference to superstition and fake news about the tzaddik bind the father more closely to his pride and prejudice, preventing the son's travel towards deeper Torah learning with the tzaddik. But the story does not contain a simple political message tied to a fleeting historical division within religious groupings. The teaching is much more profound, and it's about our inner life as well, as I will explain with reference to Moses. First, consider the spiritual level on which the adversary operates in the story, the Kabbalistic teaching. A professor, Marianne Schleicher, has written, quote, "The failure of the son to meet the tzaddik has cosmic consequences in that it prevents Malchut Shekinah from being united with Tiferet and or Yesod, and thereby prevents the initiation of the messianic process." I'm not sure about this schematic language here, and unfortunately so often Kabbalah is distorted, sometimes terribly for bad purposes, by an overemphasis on schema. I've even seen the Kabbalistic schema, which I personally describe as an intuitive map for healing and redemption, used for evil ends. Old idolatrous religions might have taught, using imagery, for example, that a child had an owl on one shoulder which would cry when the child made a mistake in their learning of indoctrinations, and a snake on the other shoulder which would hiss, etc. Such terrible teaching deference to multiple gods in psychological terms, often reinforced with large and scary replications of those owls or snakes in other interactions, which bear no resemblance to our God who is one and who has for us thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give us a future and a hope. But this teaching, which I have seen during my lifetime, does not have to use owls and snakes to create its many gods. It has even used the names of the Sephirot to try to inculcate these fears and idolatries in its children. In any case, notwithstanding the technical names of the Sephirot at play, words which properly Hasidism derived from Lurianic Kabbalah, Jewish mystical tradition, which come directly from Torah, it is the adversary who operates for disunity of elements that should be brought together. Sefaria translates these elements as minor luminary and major luminary. From Torah, the proposed unity is of God's face with ours. In the story, the failure of the son to meet the tzaddik face to face enacts the failure of the two to come together, and this disunity in the story stops the Messianic age coming itself. It prevents the long-awaited marriage of heaven and earth. So this too is where Samael, the devil, Satan, operates. So after writing on the adversary, what do you think was the greatest of the father's enemies, or who? It does seem that his greatest enemy was his son, his dead son, done away with out of this life by the devil, because it was his son's questions about learning Torah, determining his own way to learn it, seeking the teacher he needed, which appeared to lead to the activation of the father's pride, prejudice, deference to fake news, superstition, idolatrous practices. Ultimately, the son is gone, dead. So was life, finding our own way, asking questions, seeking truth, unity. Was that the enemy? But of course not, and the father repents. Generations, symbolically the grain, the life, are so precious. In the Talmud, Yevamot 63b, that's the only way I know to reference it, with apologies to those who know the proper way of referencing the Talmud. But in the Talmud, Yevamot 63b, I read the teachings by the rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yaakov ben Atzai, who say how important it is for people to have children, from Genesis 9:6 and 9:7. Ben Atzai is devoted to Torah study instead of literal reproduction, another way of furthering life, ensuring inheritance. So he does practice what he preaches about the importance of new generations. I really love the creative writing piece that one of you read aloud in week 2, describing how you would love to paint the stories of Rabbi Nahman all over the walls of your children's rooms, God willing. And I think that Nahman is very concerned with children in his stories on the literal level, but also on the deeper level of the children of Israel, of Jacob. But in the rabbi's only son, terribly, the generations, the son, are extinguished because of a lack of faith in the father. And as we saw, the father defers to his own evil inclination, to idolatrous superstition, and he prevents his son's journey towards deeper faith. The ultimate conclusion, however, is that the father returns then to his faith. He repents quickly and fully once he recognizes both the devil for who he is and his loss, which is at once his own terrible loss and a loss far greater than his personally. In this sense, Nahman is telling the story he tells in so many different ways, the teaching he surely inherited from the Baal Shem Tov. And as I said, this goes far beyond any kind of political commentary on specific historical divisions amongst the Jews of his lifetime. The teaching is as follows, that in our trajectory towards the Messianic time, we're required not to underestimate the presence of evil or the adversary in our current reality, and yet simultaneously to recognize that God is above evil. He creates it, as Isaiah 45:7 affirms. So the redemption will come, it was always promised, but that does not make our actions null. In fact, the opposite. We have very great potential in our individual lives to bring about the Messianic time. All is enmeshed. In Nahman's teaching, the internal and the personal enmesh with the external and social, one person's journey colliding with all of the fulfillment of the collective future. And the teaching is that God is with us in all the twists and turns of this trajectory, whether or not the horse falls, the axles break, etc., but that our faith is what is in our own hands. If a leaf turns in the breeze, the Baal Shem Tov taught, it is by divine providence. And when we have the greatest faith, we will see this in everything. Islam, incidentally, has the same teaching in Surah Al-An'am 59. Not a leaf falls, but that he knows it. What is so utterly terrible in this Breslov story is that the devil kills the son. Who could say that the father deserved the full loss of his son? The father returns to this absolutely fundamental or traditional value of faith and service of Hashem, but only via a great detour and wrongful path into mistrust of divine providence and trust in the false gods of pride or superstition or fake news. So terribly, the younger one had to die for the return in the elder one to the fundamental traditional principles in the faith. I told you in my introduction to the first class together that these stories have been alloyed with the development of my own soul or its journey. They have an incredible power of transformation, almost so incredible that I can't put it into words. Elie Wiesel, in fact, alluded to this regarding himself in a small joke at the beginning of his 1967 lecture, when he said that people had come to his lecture that night despite the government broadcasting messages due to very heavy snowfall that night. Don't take the highway, the parkways, don't take the midway, in other words, stay home. That here, where I live, there were scenes that looked like riots across my city during the first class fire, people jumping into fountains, that kind of thing. And I only know because my own children were on the street and sent me real-time video. And it wasn't actually a riot, but a huge football result for the city. And during the second teaching evening, the president of France, where I lived, dissolved the parliament amidst Europe-wide changes. And now here I am travelling, and I'm far away from where I was. So is the message to stay home? Thankfully, Wiesel's group did not. They attended his lecture on the legends of Hasidism, and his teaching continued to inspire mine. Perhaps we cannot stay home and we need to go out and teach until the real snow falls, that wonderful Kabbalistic metaphor, snow of redemption spoken of and glimpsed by Job when he saw the treasuries. Throughout my own spiritual experiences, lived and understood in much more of their depth thanks to the gifts that Nahman's stories provide, I saw that this story, the rabbi's only son, is also about Moses and his failure to see the people being brought into the land of Israel, and Aaron's death. So, as we read in Numbers 20 in the Torah, the people lamented the lack of water where they were. Moses petitioned God on behalf of them. God clearly told Moses and Aaron not to strike the rock, but Moses struck the rock. Why did he do it? After all his personal trials, after all the trials of the people, did our Moses want to take responsibility if God failed to provide? Did he strike the rock himself so that, if God failed to provide the water, Moses could say, oh look, it was my fault, you saw me strike the rock and the water didn't come, so the failure is down to me? Well, this thinking would have come from Moses' deepest desire that the people trust in God and not in him. It would have come from his humility, as he was the most humble man on earth, as it says in Numbers 12:13, but it would also be lack of trust in God, and that is the verdict in the Torah, that is the teaching. When God says to Moses and Aaron, because ye believe not in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Today's most respected authority on Jewish mysticism, Rabbi Ginsburg, teaches that this story is about touching and not touching, the prohibition being on touching, and I wish to follow that interpretation too. We know, I'll put a link in there as well to Rabbi Ginsburg's teaching. And I was in touch with him about this particular class, and he read a first draft of what I was going to read to you both, actually, and I'm very grateful that he said to me that he enjoyed reading it. So we know that water means study of Torah, Bava Kama 17a9. I'm sure that's not how we should read it, but that's what I have noted down, Bava Kama 17a9, referring to Isaiah 55:1. I read and experienced that Rabbi Akiva warned that those in receipt of gifts of sight should not cry, water, water, and this was a question that formed the basis of many of my prayers for some time, as I feel that my maternal grandfather had wanted to teach me this, but he'd not finished this teaching, perhaps because it carried on with strength after he died. Leaks, floods, and finally, the most incredible, so few drops of rain falling onto an area of dried grass shaped like harebells, with just a few of the grasses bowing their heads in a symphony of individually played notes, as each one, and not by any means everyone, was struck by raindrops. Perhaps this teaching from beloved Rabbi Akiva is that we should never fall prey to the delusion that the spiritual realm, if we see it, is the object of our attention, because even if we see it, we glimpse it, if we say that that is what we see, we've lost sight of what we really, physically, actually, or materially see, where we are to be as fully incarnated and active as possible. So yeah, you can hear there's a few people cycling past and a few people off to work in their lorries, etc., and a few seagulls. So by striking the rock after all his learning, his trials and his guidance of the people, Moses made it possible for people to see him as the one to follow rather than God himself, which would have been a terrible loss of sight. It would have been a closing of their eyes to what God wanted them to be open to. Such a personality cult would have taken the people not towards knowledge that God was with them, but towards a belief that they were with Moses. This would have been back to all that they'd left behind, potential deification of someone other than our one God. Even a return to the idolatries of ritualistic superstitions, the worship of a miracle-producing magician with his wand, akin to the idolatrous Egyptian beliefs in magic. So it was Moses' ultimate job to lead the people away from that past, so therefore he should not have struck the rock. Moses is perhaps the supreme mystic. He saw with the Aspaklaria Admira, the clear glass, yet on this occasion the wording he uses to address the people, you rebels, in English, suggests that he was cajoling the weak and tired, and in this case thirsty, to keep on going on a long physical journey, rather than reverently acknowledging them not as a rebellious group of travellers, but as God's people awaiting their promised land. Moses, the greatest mystic, here was maybe not using his gift of sight, because he focused too much on the immediate and the literal rebellion and thirst, rather than allowing himself to see the deeper meaning of the cry for water and the real desire for where they were going. What did the people want? Their cry for water was not on the literal level. So in Exodus 2:19, Moses is known as the Egyptian at that point, who fled to Midian and was respected there for his help in watering the flocks of the 7 daughters, and God was fully with him then. He watered flocks of animals. Here in Numbers, though, he's no longer known as the Egyptian, he's become the leader of the people, and in thinking that they needed water on a literal level only, like the flocks of animals back in Exodus, he failed to recognize them for what they were, the people, made in the image of God, who had accepted God's law. He failed to recognize the very great desire of the people for Torah, teaching for the land, for the unity. This is akin to the rabbi's son, who has the God-given gift of free will, who yearns for Torah, the face of wisdom, and instead he has his journey hampered by deference to superstition and lies. God so very much wanted to give the miracle of the waters to the people. He wanted not just to literally quench their thirst, but to give them the promised land, representing the ultimate unity on a spiritual level. His desire was and is infinitely greater and stronger than ours. God had told Moses that there was no reason to strike the rock, that God was ready, and he was ready for Moses to guide the people at that moment. Moses, in the middle, surely could not have forgotten the desire he'd felt before the receipt of the law when he smote the Egyptian, the greatest desire he had had for a life beyond slavery, an evil gone. Perhaps he in fact remembered that trauma too much, but he should not have done after God being so very much with him throughout all the trials. Moses, by striking the rock, may have misunderstood the enormity of God's desire for the people, because, had he felt it, he would have known it not necessary to strike the rock. In striking with the rod, he reverted to the symbolism of harsh authority instead of free will. It's the cane, as schoolchildren know it, and of death, smiting, rather than of life, speaking, when he had been given ample teaching that life was to come. Ah, Moses. Because of the death of Aaron and the repetition here, I think that the prohibition on touching that the Kabbalists speak of is as much about speech. In the beginning of his calling, in Exodus 7, Moses is afraid to speak, and God is angry, but he sends help in the form of Aaron. Many say that it's the striking of the rock that is repeated, because in Exodus 17, Moses is asked to smite the rock by God for water, and in Numbers 20, he is asked not to smite the rock for water. Certainly, to use an old English idiom that's apt here, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. A lot has happened. After all of Moses walking with God since Exodus, he should have had the simple faith to speak as he was asked in Numbers, but he did not speak. We know that there is a time for speaking and a time for silence. We know it from Ecclesiastes 3:7. In my own poetry, the writing, it's habla cala from the Spanish. I don't know the language of Spanish, but I borrowed my name from the film Morvern Cala, which uses that word to mean various different things about speaking and staying silent in the film. And this was Moses' time to speak, but he did not do so. We cannot say whether it was because Moses did not know his true freedom, that he was no longer in the presence of sorcerers, they'd gone, and he had no longer any need to use their language of the rod of signs of God to communicate. He could use God's language to the people, speech, as the people were listening to him. Both were punished, but the greater punishment was perhaps of Moses. Aaron died, we might say not to come back, but what a terrible loss for Moses, a loss so great, and for the mourning people. The generations of Aaron continued the priesthood as God arranged with the passing of the garments to Aaron's son. The priesthood was now necessary. Generations continued in different ways. We could add here that Moses, who had repeated smiting and had not believed in God enough to speak, was to repeat Torah on earth if we understand the transmigration of souls. When will the Messiah come? Repetition, which can be death or life, tradition or innovation, teaching or learning. In the rabbi's only son, there is also that element of repetition. The father repeatedly believes not in God's omnipresent divine providence, but in signs that lead him away from the truth, the devil in disguise. But there's also repetition of the truth, for as many times as it takes for the father to turn truly to the laws of his tradition, simple faith, trust or belief, love and fear of God alone, as the father dreams repeatedly of his son's reproach, the message that will bring him to understand and to repent. So I'll finish this teaching with a personal anecdote. My maternal grandmother was quite fond of superstitious sayings. My maternal grandfather, he really wasn't, not at all, but I inherited both ways through my mother. And it was a long way to discover that the superstitions, counting magpies, picking up pennies, not walking on cracks in the pavement, did not serve me at all, whereas prayer does, always. I cannot blame my grandmother, it was her own upbringing. And so I also have to acknowledge that whilst I teach, I cannot deny my own past ways and what I've learned from them, what I still learn all the time. They were detours, bringing me closer to Torah, and also closer to what it means to teach and to speak for God. I've cried so much for the death of Aaron. I've been really sick with grief for the loss of Aaron, whose death was such a loss for Moses. And of course for all those children of the Holocaust, which we can only perhaps see as prophetically foreseen by Rabbi Nahman in the story of the death of the son. So this is a prayer for all siblings, brothers, sisters, children, whether lost or found, but always in the hands of God. In terms of the homework or the writing exercises, which you could take time to do in relation to today's class, well, I might suggest that you describe a famous picture of the death of Aaron, if that's something that you would like to try in creative writing. There is a wonderful picture painted by James Jack Joseph Tissot, Tissot, which could perhaps be described as a creative writing exercise. That's not directly connected with Rabbi Nahman's story, though. More closely connected to the story of the rabbi's only son, you could write about your own family's relationship with superstition or with fake news or with self-determination. Or otherwise, you could do any creative writing piece associatively from this story. For example, on the theme of loss or childlessness or generations or guidance and self-determination. And I'm finishing the recording now. It's just short of 30 minutes. So I'll allow you to go and to do some writing on this. And then for the final class of this 5-week series, we will discuss together the writing that we have produced and share our thoughts on some of the teaching that we have absorbed in these 4 classes together. Thank you very much for listening.